as we go along, that's okay. My name's Adina. I want to welcome you this evening to our evening for us in Israel. Tonight's presentation is long-term planning for young professionals and families. This is geared for people that are not making Aliyah this year. If you are making Aliyah this year, we had a webinar last week that's on our YouTube channel, and you can feel free to watch it as that will be more specific for you. I want to just start off by saying that on the bottom, there's Q&A. Please direct your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, and we will do our best to answer your questions. My name is Adina. I am joined by my colleague, Yitz, who you can see in the other window. I have been working at Nefesh Benefits since 2006. I've had the privilege of helping lots of Olim, and specifically families, make Aliyah. And I'm looking forward to giving you guys some tools tonight. Yitz, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Yitz Wiener. I'm an Aliyah advisor at Nefesh Benefits. I actually work on Adina's team. I'm working there for 2 years with families and all different types of demographics of people making Aliyah. And looking forward to working on this presentation with you guys tonight.
Great. So I'd like to start off by saying that some people think that making Aliyah means that you have to be a superhero. We were just talking about it beforehand, that sometimes people like stand up and, put their arms up like this and say, I'm Superman, I'm Spider-Man, whichever, Wonder Woman, whichever one you like. But you don't have to be a superhero to make Aliyah. What we are going to do tonight is everybody here is already researching when you want to make Aliyah, not this year. And that means that you're really on the ball. You're starting to look into the things that we'll speak about tonight, so that when it comes down to the actual time when you're making Aliyah in that year beforehand, you'll be an expert. You'll be in so much better shape than other people will have been. And so tonight we will talk about a bunch of those things. Yitz will give you an idea now of what we'll be talking about.
Okay, so like Adina said, you guys are planning, you're ahead of the game here. You're looking at Aliyah in a year from now. It's important to looking at the screen in front of us, it's important to consider Aliyah in two parts. It's two main parts, obviously one being the process and the other being the planning. The process of Aliyah is something that you can start now by filling out an application, by reading up on the rights and benefits that you have as potential Olim. Some of the documentation is possible to start now, some is not. The word eligibility there is indicating, just making sure that there are no bumps in the road, nothing unorthodox, nothing that may cause, provide a problem down the road with making Aliyah. So that's what you're planning. You're starting now. You're starting the process now. The planning aspect, obviously, we're going to touch on that also. It's just as important. There's no real time to start. It's not too early ever to really start looking into these things, whether it's the community you want to live in, how you're going to make money and survive here in Israel, the different education. It's obviously different than it is in the US. So there's different kinds of schooling here. We'll touch on it a little bit later. And healthcare, obviously, it's a huge difference in comparison to America. But it's important to really look at these two things separately, but obviously together. They're all components of making Aliyah, but some of the process you can do now, some of it you can't really, there's no point in starting now, but there's no harm in starting to plan now and to use some of the things we're going to talk about tonight as your first steps in preparing for Aliyah.
Great. So before we speak about all the processing piece of Aliyah, which Yitz will probably go more into details about in a little bit, I think it's important to take a second and explain when we talk about Aliyah, it's divided into two parts. Is becoming a citizen of the country, and that's actually becoming a citizen. And then there's the actual benefits. Now, what does that mean? Israel has an office, a government office called Misrad HaKlita, the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption, that gives benefits to Olim, people that are making Aliyah. That's about the benefits, but to actual becoming a citizen of the country, that's the first part of the process that you go through. And if I go a little bit further, sometimes people will say, oh, my father's Israeli, my mother's Israeli. What does that have to do with it? And I want to take a second because these words, some of these words are in Hebrew, but I'm going to start using those words because it's important that you understand what this is. There are different statuses when you make Aliyah. An Oleh Chadash is someone that has no Israeli background. That means that they're becoming a citizen and that they're entitled to all the benefits by the fact that they're becoming a citizen of the country. Ezrach Oleh, a word of Hebrew, Ezrach means citizen. Okay, might test you guys at the end. Ezrach means a citizen that's making Aliyah. What is that? That's someone that was born abroad to either parent or both parent are Israeli. And therefore, they already have, and I'll put this in quotations, citizenship because their parents are Israeli, but it's about the benefits for someone like that. Same as Katin Choser. Katin is a minor. Choser means a returning minor. Please don't get that mixed up with the last one, which is a Toshav Choser, which is a returning citizen. Those are two different statuses. A Katin Choser is someone that was born in Israel and left as a kid before the age of 14. And all those three statuses, Oleh Chadash, Ezrach Oleh, and Katin Choser, are all eligible to make Aliyah. But if I go back to the slide beforehand, the difference is that the Oleh Chadash is becoming a citizen and entitled to benefits, where the other statuses are people that are already citizens but are entitled to benefits. There is two other statuses that it's something to keep in mind with, that if you ever lived in Israel on a temporary resident, you still are eligible for Aliyah, but it may affect some of your benefits. And the last status is something called Mishpachat Olim. What does that mean? Mishpachat Olim means someone that was one person in the family, okay, is one of those three. Oleh Chadash, Ezrach Oleh, Katin Choser, one of those statuses. And they're married to a Toshav Choser, which is the last one, and they have kids born abroad. Now, this is very technical, and you don't need to know all these details right now, but know that if you have any Israeli background in your family, it potentially can affect your benefits. And that means that sometimes you might have to provide different paperwork in the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about this screen here. Okay, Aliyah process. Who's bringing you home? So, Adina mentioned some of these entities already. We're just going to go through them because there's a lot of different people involved, and sometimes it seems confusing. You're not sure who you're supposed to be talking to. Nefesh Benefits, the Jewish agency. We throw around, like Adina said already, some different ministries, some different governmental offices. And the point here is just to give you an idea of who's who and what each person's portion or responsibility is in the process. There will be other departments and other names and other ministries that you will hear, but these are the main ones, okay? Nefesh Benefits, obviously that's us. We work with Olim making Aliyah from North America and Canada and sometimes England, as well as Olim who are making Aliyah from within Israel. We do not approve your Aliyah, okay? We cannot make certain decisions either, but we are here to fully hold your hand and support you as much as possible, advocate on your behalf, guide you, show you, share with you information in order to make your Aliyah as successful as possible, okay? Now, I purposely said that we cannot make certain decisions and we don't approve your Aliyah because who does, for the most part? The Jewish agency. The Jewish agency has the mandate to approve Aliyah from the Israeli government. So ultimately, every file, whether it's from North America or elsewhere in the world, makes its way to the Jewish agency. There are a bunch of different departments within the Jewish agency that will partake in your Aliyah as well. We don't need to get into those now. But the Jewish agency, like I said, is the actual entity that will be approving your Aliyah. Often there are things that come up, unique situations, questions, things that are just impossible to move forward with. So that's when the Jewish agency is the decision maker and can help go, make a decision one way or another. The Israeli consulate, they are a factor in a few different manners and for different statuses. As Dina mentioned, they have more of a responsibility than others. But for the most part, most people who are, anybody who's not an Israeli citizen, okay, who's making Aliyah with an American or Canadian or any other passport, will be getting an Aliyah visa, just like a tourist visa or just like an entry permit to another country. You'll be getting an Aliyah visa that is issued by the Israeli consulate. There are other things that they are involved with. For instance, some of the Israeli citizen statuses sometimes have to go through the consulate, or they are assisted by the consulate at times, depending on the situation. COVID has changed certain things. Mishra Klita, Adina mentioned them, the Ministry of Aliyah and Integration. Obviously, they're a huge part of Aliyah. They're not necessarily approving your Aliyah, but they are definitely giving you and all the benefits, or most of the benefits that are issued to Olim. They determine your status, your eligibility. They're very involved in the final parts of the process, but they're a very important factor. One office that's not mentioned here that I'm just going to throw out real quickly is the Ministry of Interior, Misrad Pnim. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you will all be getting, please God, Israeli IDs and a Tu'udat Zehut, that's what it's called in Hebrew. And that is issued by the Ministry of Interior. And there are other things that they're involved with also, but I figured it was important to just hear that name as well.
100%. Good catch.
Okay, the timeline. Now, as we said in the beginning, this meeting, this webinar here is not for people who are making Aliyah this year. Okay, it's not meant for people. If somebody decides to make it happen this year, fine. But the idea here is to think about next year or a few years down the road. The first thing, other than research that you should be doing and asking friends and just picking at the idea or toying with it, throwing it around with the kids and stuff like that. The first real step in the Aliyah process is filling out an application on the Nefesh Benefits website. Now, like I said, it's the first real step. Obviously, the other things I mentioned before are important, and you should start doing them at your own convenience. But when you fill out an application, you are sharing a lot of information. You are spending the time to do this, and upon completion, you will get an email from Nefesh Benefits congratulating you on that first step and pairing you with an Aliyah advisor, somebody like myself, who will be your go-to person at Nefesh Benefits and whose job it is to help you in any way they can and guide you through the Aliyah process. Okay, so that would really be the first physical step that you're taking in the Aliyah process. After you fill out the application, like I said, you get an Aliyah advisor. You will work with them and your family and everybody else on putting together all the documents that you need for your file. That is a big part of the process, the Aliyah process that we talked about earlier. You will put as many of those papers together, submit them to the Jewish agency. We won't get into what documents you need. You need the majority of the documents in order to move on to the next stage, which is the Jewish agency interview. Now, the interview nowadays is a two-part thing. You first drop off your documents or send your documents to them, the original ones for the Jewish agency to review, and then they set up a time for a Zoom meeting. It's important that anybody who is making Aliyah, parents especially, both parents should be in this meeting. They will have reviewed your documents. They'll go over some of the documents with you. They'll talk to you about your Aliyah plans, where you want to live, what you expect to do for a living. Somebody's retiring, I guess it's not the right place anyways for that, so we won't get into that. Anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, things change. It varies based on seasons. After your interview, you should, please God, hopefully get an email saying that you've been approved for Aliyah. In between there could be some documents that are asked of you, but assuming everything went smoothly at the interview, you should expect that Aliyah email, the Aliyah approval email from the Jewish agency. At that time, you can apply for your visa. Okay, in that email will be the instructions and the paperwork that's needed for applying for a visa. The visa I talked about earlier that will be put into your passport, and then you contact our flights department and you book your flight home. Okay, so there's a lot of information, obviously a lot of steps, but your Aliyah advisor will help you plan and create a timeline and go through it with you. Okay.
And probably after listening to Yitz, you're probably thinking about, okay, so when should I do this? Because as I started in the beginning, I said, this is not geared for people that are making Aliyah in 2021, because if you are, then you should already have filled out an application, or you're signing off right now and you're going to fill out an application. What we really encourage people to do is to fill out an application within 8 to 10 months of when you plan on making Aliyah. I think it's one most important thing is that a lot of people are afraid to press the button submit because they're worried that they're committing themselves to something. And I assure you, and I'm being recorded, so I'm 100% confident in saying that this doesn't commit you to anything. What it does is that it puts everything in like an organized fashion. Once as Yitz explained, once you fill out the application, you'll have like a whole dashboard that will tell you all the documents you need to submit. You could see as you've uploaded things, and your advisor will work with you to keep you on that process. Now, let's say, okay, I'll skip down to the last thing, because something that I usually, before COVID, when we actually met people in real life, one of the things I would always ask in the room is how many people here's parents are Israeli? And then my next question would be, how many people have Israeli passports? Israeli law states that when you are born to an Israeli parent abroad, you're supposed to get a passport when you're born, not connected to Aliyah. And therefore, it is one of the required documents for Aliyah. And that is something that you can start working on now. You don't need to wait unless you're above the age of 28. If you are above the age of 28 and you've never issued an Israeli passport, you cannot issue an Israeli passport until you have the interview with the Jewish agency. Because what they say, if you contact the consulate, one of the organizations that Yitz mentioned a few minutes ago, they will tell you, get on a plane, go to Israel and get your passport, which you can't do currently. God willing, that will change very soon. So therefore, that is something to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that if you were born in the former Soviet Union, and Yitz will explain in a little bit about this, or you are a temporary resident, which is called what was known as an A1, so that might ring a bell for some people, you may be required to submit more documents. And if that's the case, you want to have the time to be able to do that. So therefore, if you're on any of those, I would tell you start 10 months beforehand. But if you're very simple, I don't want to use the word simple. If you have no Israeli background and you've never lived in Israel and you weren't born in a different country, then you can even start with 8 months and you should be okay. Do you want to just give a little bit about what documents people need to submit?
Absolutely. Okay. There's a lot of documents, or it seems like it's a lot of documents sometimes. I'm sure that's what you hear a lot of. But you're starting now. It's important to get a head start. There will be additional things to what's on this slide, as it says on the bottom there, but these are the important things. Obviously, a valid passport. In order to make Aliyah, you need a visa, like we said, in that passport. So you should make sure that you have at least a year left on your passport. If somebody's getting close to that mark now, this would be a good time to consider renewing it. Obviously, based on turnaround times in your region, in your area due to COVID, check that before, but it's important to have a valid passport for this purpose of immigration. Proof of Judaism, it will be a letter from a rabbi stating that you're Jewish. There are all sorts of specific questions and cases and this and that. Obviously, we're not going to go into them all now, but this is exactly the kind of thing that your Aliyah advisor will help you with and help you figure out. Conversion, same thing. Somebody asked before a question in the Q&A about conversion. Somebody who converted to Judaism. So they are Jewish and they probably will be eligible for Aliyah, or may be eligible. It just needs to be reviewed. So they may have some additional documentation that they need to show. Civil documents with Apostille. I'm sure you all have heard the word Apostille thrown around a lot. We actually will talk about that specifically in a minute, but civil documents are birth certificates, marriage, death, name change, divorce decrees, all sorts of things that are issued by your state or your county or something to that effect. They will need an apostille on them. And again, we'll touch on that in a second, what that is, but most of them will need apostilles. There are certain forms that the Jewish agency issues. I like to refer to these as the easy documents that are in the process. And really, when you do fill out your application and you do start to look at everything, and you say, oh my God, they want 15 things or 8 things or 12 things. Remember that 3 or 4 of them are very easy to just do on the spot. There's an entry and exit form. You list your trips to Israel. There's a health declaration. Easy forms, things that you don't need anybody's assistance or to send them out to take care of. Criminal background check with an apostille. So you probably heard a lot about this as well. Currently, yes, if any of you are thinking to yourselves that you heard that this can be done without an apostille, that is the case today. It may not be the case at the end of this year or even in 6 months from now or possibly next year. It really depends on the Jewish agency and the Israeli government and other things that are COVID related and turnaround time related and stuff like that. But you need to go into this thinking that you need a criminal background check with an apostille, a federal apostille, an apostille from the federal government. Okay, it takes some time to get. It's valid for 6 months, as it says there. So there's no point in doing it in January if you're making Aliyah in the summer. You need to consider when is a good time to do that. Obviously, you and your Aliyah advisor will talk about this with your timeline, and also you'll get an update as to what those turnaround times are and approximately, and what the policy is at that time of the Jewish agency and the government of Israel regarding the apostille on the background check. And like I said, there will be additional things. There are a lot of specific cases, people who are married multiple times, or people who, I don't know, there are all sorts of different situations where you may need additional documentation. Ideally, you'll know about this in the beginning of the process. Sometimes things come up during the process, and sometimes things come up at your interview with the Jewish agency, where they hear certain things or things come up in the discussion, and they say, okay, so, while we wait for this, while you wait for your approval, please submit a couple more documents. But that's already very specific. Okay. Let's go into the next one. What is an apostille? Drum roll.
Drum roll, exactly.
What is an apostille? So a lot of people may know what it is already, but I'm going to assume that this is the first time that some of you are hearing about it, and just give a kind of an idea of what it is. And hopefully at the end of this slide, you'll understand that it's not the biggest deal in the world, and just have a little bit more clarity about it, okay? As it says here, an apostille is an international certification that allows documents to be certified for legal purposes in another country. That's a lot of words for. There are countries that are part of the Hague Convention. Israel is, America is, a lot of other countries are, Canada is not. We'll touch on that in a second. So any civil document that is submitted to another government or to another country, in this case, all the documents that you guys are putting together and putting in your file, you will be submitting to the Israeli government. The Israeli government wants to know that these are, in fact, have been issued by the proper authorities and have been signed by the right person and are not forgeries or anything like that. So the purpose of validating these signatures is so that when the Israeli government or any of the ministries that receive these documents, they're comfortable and they know that they're looking at proper, legit, real documents. Okay, the apostille is issued by the state that issued the document. So somebody who has a child who was born in LA and they were married in New York and then they moved to Florida, they will need apostilles from each of these states. If you were born and married in Texas and all your kids were married in Texas, then you will only need from the state of Texas. Some states have extra steps in the process. They don't just take your birth certificate and say, okay, I know this signature and that's fine, and I'm going to verify and I'm going to authenticate the signature. Some of the states want a middle party, often the county where the document is issued, to verify the signature first, that's on the certificate, on the actual civil document, and then the state will verify that county signature.
Yes, I'm going to interrupt for a second and say, I'm from New York, so I can say this and nobody can say anything. It's when you're just saying some states, it's New York, and it's anybody that was born or married in the 5 boroughs. It's specifically born in the 5 boroughs. when people complain about bureaucracy in Israel, then my answer to them is New York is probably worse in some ways. And I could say that because I lived in New York for a very long time. Sorry. Now you can.
It's okay. That's okay. So Adina's right. It's really New York is the biggest problem. Some other states do require a authentication, but for the most part, New York is the more difficult one. Anybody who needs birth certificates from New York, you'll go over the specifics with your Aliyah advisor. These are the kind of things, I'll get back to that in a second. Canada, let's touch on Canada real quick. Canada is not part of the Apostille Treaty, not part of the Hague Convention. So the documents that are issued by Canada, birth certificates, marriage certificates, and so on and so forth, they also must be certified by a chain of signatures, and it's done by the Israeli consulate. Okay? Sometimes, as it says here, the certified criminal record check, that's the RCMP, the background check that the Canadians need to do, needs to go through the Global Affairs Office in Ottawa. Okay, so just like I said that there are some states, New York, who the county has to authenticate the document, the actual civil document. So there are some Canadian documents. We know for sure that the background check has to go through the Global Affairs Office in Ottawa, be authenticated by them, and only then sent to the Israeli consulate. Okay, we've been doing this for a while, so we have a lot of information about it, and we'll advise you properly as you get closer. An apostille does not expire. Okay, so if you don't have birth certificates, or you don't have marriage certificates, or you were married once before, and you need to get, I'm just going to throw it out there, or somebody who's married and divorced needs to get, and now married again, needs to get their previous marriage and divorce certificates with apostilles. So if there are any of these things you can start working on now, great. It's a good idea to start. These things don't expire. And because of COVID, the turnaround times are longer than usual. They may change next year, but no harm, no foul to start now. Like I said, it doesn't expire. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Okay, special paperwork cases, right. So we said, and this is not necessarily what I was referring to about additional documentation before. There will be some things. Some of them I'll touch on here, but some of them, you just need to know that if you fall under any of these things, you most probably will need some additional documentation. Nothing that we've never seen before. You're not the first person to go through any of these things. Remember that. So there is a solution, and the knowledge is there. You just have to, sometimes it's extra steps, a few extra things to take care of. Okay, so Adina mentioned before a little bit, I think, Lishkat HaKesher. This is Olim who were born in the former Soviet Union. The policy or the rulings on this changed a little bit in the last 6 months. We won't go into the specifics right now, but I'll give you just a little bit of an overview. If somebody migrated to the US after 1989, okay, then they are considered somebody who needs to go through Lishkat HaKesher. Okay, that basically means that they have some extra documentation that they need to provide from Russia or from wherever the country that the country in the former Soviet Union. There's a person in the Jewish agency that will handle their application for part of the process, but that is a specific case, as referred to here, special paperwork cases. If you migrated to the U.S. before 1989, then for the most part it's a regular on the application, and there probably will not be any extra documentation asked of you. And unregistered Ezrach Oleh, these are Olim who were born to Israeli parents outside of Israel. One of the statuses that Adina mentioned earlier, who were never registered. In other words, they do not have an Israeli passport, and their parents never did go to the Israeli consulate and say, "Hi, we're Israeli. We had a kid here in America. We want to register them as Israeli citizens." A lot of people never did it. It's not abnormal to not have done that. Very often it doesn't even come up. But when you're making Aliyah, that's one of the things that are important to you. You'll mention it on your application. It will then populate that in your file. You'll talk about it with your Aliyah advisor. Obviously, there's no point in holding back on any of these things. It's best to share everything, and even just to be told, no, you're just a regular, no special case here. But it's best to share the information. I touched on conversion earlier. No problem. There's just additional documentation that you need to provide. Depends on when you converted, how old you were, with your family, by yourself, and what you're doing, today, things like that. adoption, name changes, error in documents, previous marriages. These are all things that, like I said about the Israeli passports, sometimes they don't even come up. You don't even think twice about the fact that your birth certificate says one name and your passport says another name, even though you know the connection between the names. It never bothered you. But for making Aliyah, when you're immigrating to another country, it's going to come up. So there are some specific situations where you have to take into consideration that you may need additional documents. Letters from doctors, additional Jewish agency documentation. These are things that come up often at the Jewish agency interview, sometimes before. And again, none of these things are so unique that there's no solution for it. But when it comes up, or if you think that there's something you should mention, letters from doctors obviously are referring to health issues, health matters. It's best to bring these things up with your Aliyah advisor. You will fill out a health declaration, like a self-filling out health declaration. So the more information you share, the more accurate information, the better we can address that and assist you with preparing for that. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. Aliyah eligibility. Okay. We're going to talk here a little bit about the benefits. I don't want to get into them to the nitty gritty. There's a lot of information about each one. And I'm sure some of you have questions of, maybe I made Aliyah in the past. I saw in the Q&A, I made Aliyah in the past. My parents did. I want to. All sorts of things. They're all legitimate questions, and you should bring them up. For today, we're not going to answer them today. And I'm not going to go into all the benefits and the specifics, but you see them in front of you. This information is on our website, obviously, but I will run through them with you. Okay, so somebody making Aliyah from the US or Canada will get a free flight, and they're entitled to bring 2 pieces of luggage instead of 1 with them. You will get a taxi from the airport to your first destination, wherever that may be. Basic Israeli healthcare. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about that. That's a relatively big benefit for a lot of you because of the high cost of healthcare in the US and Canada. So the basic plan is given to you. There are supplemental plans, different levels of healthcare, which you can talk about. You can definitely purchase and stuff like that. They're still far from the cost that you paid in America, but that is already something you pay for. OPAN, a lot of you are familiar with this as well. This is courses for learning Hebrew. Now there's a structured OPAN that's given to all Olim, that's offered to all Olim. It's not always appropriate. It doesn't always fit into the schedule of working parents, people who have young kids and stuff like that. And you may not be able to attend those specific things. So this is something you'll talk to the Ministry of Aliyah about, bring it up with your Aliyah advisor. But you should know that obviously OPAN is one of the benefits. There are tax breaks in your income tax. Arnona you can learn that word, Arnona. It is the equivalent of real estate taxes. And there's a tax break on passive, not active, passive international income. I'm sure that will lead to a few questions with your Aliyah advisor. But passive income is what it sounds like. Real estate, portfolios, things that you're not actually doing anything to earn the money. So that means if you live in Israel, made Aliyah, but you work for an American company, that's not passive income, that's active income. Okay? There's some custom benefits. I'm sure you've heard about bringing in a lift. Some people think about bringing in a car. There's a tax benefit on buying a new car here in Israel. Lower mortgage rate. There's something that exists. It's not always lower, so it's not always a benefit. Sal Klita, it's a huge one. That is the absorption basket. That means money, cash that the government is giving you based on the size of your family, your age. There's a certain calculator that is put together for each specific family, and you can help. Your Aliyah advisor can help you figure out what that amount is. Rent subsidy that goes on for up to 5 years after Aliyah. It's not going to cover your rent, but it's a little bit of additional money that the government gives you to help towards your bills. Let's call it your utility bills or something related to rent. And for those who are relevant, for those that it's relevant, there are higher education subsidies. It actually says age limits apply. So for some of you younger couples and professionals who may be coming still in their 20s, some of these things may be relevant. Master's degree for some of you. So bring it up if it's relevant with your Aliyah advisor.
Okay, thank you, Yet. So I actually want everybody to take a breath for a second because we just shared a lot of information about the process and documents. And I'm sure, as you said, we've seen a bunch of questions already in the Q&A. I saw a few people try to raise their hand, try to write your questions in the Q&A, and we're really getting to answer all of them. I do want to take the next 15 minutes to talk about the other part of Aliyah planning. And that is the planning part, not the processing part. And that means when we talk about the community and where am I going to live? How does the school work? It's mentioned a little bit about healthcare. I'm going to go a little bit more into information about that. And the last thing is finances. All of these pieces will help make your Aliyah more successful. Now, something that you don't see on this slide, because really it is connected to everything about planning, and that is Hebrew. Learning Hebrew is, I'm not going to lie to you and say that you can't walk around in Israel and people won't try to speak in English, because they will, because it exists and that happens. However, Hebrew is the language of the country. And that means that when you go into a supermarket, the food items or your receipt, when you pay, everything is going to be in Hebrew. Any bills that you get are in Hebrew. Can you walk into a government office and sometimes people can speak English? Yes, in some cities, but on a whole, you need to try to do what you can to learn Hebrew. And therefore, what I'm going to suggest is a few things. One, if you go onto our YouTube channel, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to mention it a few times because we have lots of valuable recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. And one of the things that's even live is something called Cafe Ole, which is a way to learn Hebrew. If you like listening to the news and you go on to an US website to watch news, go on to one of the Israeli websites, read one little thing and see what you can get from that. Additionally, reading a book, watching a video, some people have Netflix, you might watch Shissel or Fauda or any of those things. Those are all things that you can definitely help with your Hebrew. Now, the next two, I'm going to say community, and I'm going to also click to education because a lot of times these things connect. When someone's moving to Israel, you want to think, no matter how old you are and where you are in your life, you're going to try to think about where do you want to live. Now, we do have a webinar on our YouTube channel about how to find the community. So I'm not going to go into details about this, but I do think that this is something that you can start researching now. If you haven't been to Israel yet, God willing, when COVID is getting better, and it seems to be getting better, and you'll be able to come and visit Israel, we will definitely encourage you to come and visit before you move here. If you've been here in the past, that doesn't mean that you might have come as like a visitor, as a tourist. It's not the same thing as living here. And you have to decide if you want to live in a big city, if you want to live in a small city. Do you want to live in the north of the country, the south of the country, central part? Do you want to live in a community that has a lot of English speakers? Do you want to live in the opposite, that there's not as many English speakers? When we talk about affordability, it tends to be that where there are more Anglos, and I'm going to use the word Anglos because it's not only Americans, wherever there's more English speakers, the prices of a community potentially could go up. And that's also something to keep in mind. A lot of times people will ask, should I buy, should I rent? If you're moving to a place and your family lives there and that's where you're going and that's where you want to live, then great, then you can go and buy. But if you're not sure, you're better off renting in the beginning to try and get to see how the community is, how it works for you. Any of the housing benefits you can use after your first year, so it's not a problem. And a colleague of mine, and yet always says this, and this leads into the education piece, is that you're only as happy as your most unhappy child. And I really think that that is really valuable information, or like important to keep in mind when you're researching all these things and making this decision, because what might be good for you personally might not be good for your child when it comes, and then you have to decide what's good. And then between your children, which one of your kids is going to be more flexible versus the one that might not be as flexible, because every kid is different. And so that's other things for you to keep in mind. When it comes to education, the first thing that you have to understand If in America you go to public school, then this won't be so different to you. But if your kids go to a private school in the States, the first thing that you have to understand, whether it's in the US or Canada, is that the schools in Israel, it's a public school system. And that means that now there's religious and non-religious public schools, but it's a public school. I'm going to say that a few times. You can't compare a private school to a public school. School is Sunday to Friday, but the hours are shorter. In Israel, kids have a lot more freedom than America. Kids love that. Parents have a hard time with that sometimes. But kids love it. And that's something also for you to keep in mind. There is a in-between group, which I always call it's the private public, okay? Which means that they are a public school in the sense that they fall under the auspices of the Ministry of Education, and they are run by that, but they don't have to accept you, number one. And two, you might pay a little bit more, and that's nothing compared to what you'd be paying for like a private day school in the States, so that you can get a little bit more services. Now, the one thing that I want to calm down everybody is that when it comes to within the year of your Aliyah, you're going to start hearing when you have kids, the registration for, especially for elementary school and nursery school, is in January, February time. And you're like, what do I do? So one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is that wherever you're moving, they have to have a place for you in a school. It might not be your first choice, but they have to have a place for you in the school. And you can't register technically until you're a citizen. Now, for those who have Israeli passports, this is where this comes in for advantage for you because you might be able to register earlier. But either way, I want to calm down everybody and say that you will be able to register your kids for school. In communities that have municipal coordinators, there are certain communities in Israel that, because there's a big group of English-speaking Olim that move there, they have coordinators that are there to help Olim in that community. And so in any community, that means Yerushalayim, Modi'in, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheva, Efrat, Gush Etzion, Zichron, Ranana. Missing anyone yet? I can't think.
Covered a lot.
Okay. All of them have municipal coordinators. We will connect you with them and they can help you with that process. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of education, and this actually just came up recently with a family that made Aliyah. The government of Israel does provide some help for your kids, okay? There is a certain amount of hours that your kids will get in school to help them because they're moving to a different country with a new language. That being said, Yitz will talk about the budget in a little bit about thinking about your finances. And it's important to keep in mind that you might have to get a tutor. I know that personally, I actually made Aliyah when I was a child, and my parents made Aliyah actually. And for me, it was the hardest thing to think about the fact that I had to have a tutor and that how is that going to be? And so that's something that you should keep in mind. Before we get to finances, we mentioned a little bit about healthcare, but I'm just going to go, first of all, there is a really great webinar on our YouTube channel about healthcare given by a doctor that talks for an hour just about the healthcare system. So of course, in like 2 minutes, I cannot cover what they're going to cover, what this covered in an hour, but I strongly suggest that you watch that. The biggest thing that you have to understand about healthcare in Israel, and I do think that this is an unbelievable thing, is that every citizen of the country is entitled to healthcare, no matter what if you have any pre-existing conditions, it's not held against you. Every citizen of the country is entitled to healthcare, and that's an amazing blessing. And I can say that as someone that has been through COVID this year, the fact that a lot of us are vaccinated is a very good way to see that. The services are provided through 4 HMOs. In Hebrew, they're called Kupat Cholim or Kupot. You will hear this a lot. Maccabi, Me'uchadet, Klalit, and Leumit. Those are the 4 Kupot Cholim. You have to decide which one you'd like to register for. before you make Aliyah. There are ways to research it there's the Shira Pransky Project, which also has a great Facebook group called Navigating the Israeli Healthcare System. There is another website called Kol Zchut that has a lot of information in English about healthcare. And speaking to people that live in your community. How you choose a kuppah is going to be based on what's available in the city that you're moving to. If you're moving to a city that only has two, you're not going to register for a different one because that wouldn't pay. And if there's a specific doctor that someone recommends, you might want to find out what kuppah they belong to, and then that would be the reason why you choose that. And the last thing is you want to research what medications that you're on to see if they're recognized in Israel and people, and you can get them in Israel. And that goes back to what when Yitz mentioned before about the health declaration and about a letter from a doctor. The reason why they're asking those questions is so that you do the right research. Now, all of this, the healthcare system, even as Yitz mentioned, the supplemental plans, the amount of money that you pay for that is nothing. People coming, not from Canada, because I know from Canada it's different and it's more socialized medicine, but from the US, when you hear the prices, you will laugh. I promise you. But speaking about finances, Yitz, take it away.
Okay. Okay, so finance is obviously on everybody's mind when you're planning Aliyah. And I'm sure a lot of it's fueled by other people, other Olim, other people who are in the process, who maybe lived in Israel in the past and now live in your neighborhood in the United States or in Canada. And, you know, a lot of things are probably accurate. And it's important to remember a few things about finances. That is that, like anywhere else, we work, we earn money, we buy things, we go away, we do this, we do that. There's a lot of trains of thought, or I mean, people think that everybody in Israel lives in minus, and that's just the way it is here. And yeah, I'm sure some people do because it's available and it's possible. But I would say that most people, I mean, it's not something to be fearful of if you spend the time planning and properly creating a budget of some sort and working out some of the expenses. There will be things like we mentioned, both Dina and myself, that you'll say, wow, I can't believe that that's all it costs. And there will be other things that if you can go back, I just want to touch on some of those things a little bit more. There will be some specific things that are different and that you'll be surprised about how little they are. And there will be other things that you'll be surprised about how expensive they are. You got to remember a few different things. As a whole, people probably earn less money in Israel for the same kind of a job. Okay, it's not across the board. Obviously, you've all heard about the Israeli high-tech field and the different companies here. I'm sure we can compete with just about anyone in that area. But there are other, doctors, lawyers, accountants, all sorts of other positions where people probably will make less money than they would have in America. It's important to keep your eyes open, obviously, from now already, network a little bit, try and see what kind of employment opportunities there are. One thing that's been big this year that is, it's happening a lot more this year because of COVID is the fact that people can work remotely. And that has been a game changer for a lot of different people. So if that is an option that you can look into, then that's great. It's something you should consider. We obviously would love more and more people to work in Israel and be part of that. But these are the decisions that you need to make, and you need to make them for yourself and your family, and you'll make whatever's right for you. Taxes, I'll just touch on it for a second. In Israel, most salaried employees do not file taxes. There's no need for it. So while everybody in America has to file by April 14th or extend by 15th, whatever it is, and these are things that are part of your lexicon, here it's different. You don't file taxes. The taxes you pay are different. There are certain things that you may be responsible to pay partially to Israel, partially to America. These are all things that will come up, but there are things that need to be considered. And somebody who's self-employed or somebody who's going to work remotely or somebody who has different businesses and stuff like that should speak to an accountant and find out now, what are the laws today? What are your responsibilities financially to each country in your specific line of work? Obviously, if things change, they change, but it's very important, for these kind of questions to have an accountant. And one crucial thing, there's benefits here that you get from the government and all sorts of other things. But I want to touch on lifestyle changes for a second, just because this tends to come up often. when people come on pilot trips, or when they, this year, a lot of people came and made Aliyah without pilot trips. And yes, most of you will have a smaller house in Israel than you do in America. And sometimes a lot of people only have one car or no car, as opposed to two new cars in America and stuff like that. And I'm not saying this is the same for everybody. I know it's not, but there are certain things that people are accustomed to that may have to change, and they may not. So it's just something to keep in mind when preparing, and to, it helps to share these things with your kids as well. Certain things, obviously, so that they're not in shock when they get here. Okay, now we'll look briefly at this. I just want to say that this is basically a budget that we put together at Nefesh. Somebody put this together. It's for a family of 6. There's a lot of information here. First of all, I'll just say, obviously, this is being recorded, this webinar, this information of the budget and other types of budgets for smaller families, for single people, for retirees. It may not be relevant for this webinar, but we have information about all the different kinds of demographics that may come up. And of course, if your family, if you have 2 kids instead of 4 that's listed here, or 3 or 1, or whatever it is, you can adjust this accordingly. A lot of this, I was looking at this with Adina earlier, a lot of this is very accurate. I have a family of 6, I have 4 kids. My mortgage payment or rent is right around that number. The food that's almost accurate, like it's very close to accurate for my family for a month. Utilities is pretty accurate. The municipal taxes, that will vary on where you live. That's why there's a big gap there. Certain cities and neighborhoods are it's just more expensive to live in, and the real estate taxes are higher. I'm sure a lot of you know exactly what I'm talking about. The additional insurances that we talked about, the health insurance first. Health insurance is free, but the supplemental we talked about is, and it's not free, it's just very, 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 very cheap in comparison to what you pay. And the supplementals are a little bit additional. Adina mentioned tutoring. You cannot need a tutor at all, and you may need a tutor for each of your kids, or just for one of them. And maybe it's math, maybe it's Hebrew, maybe it's twice a week, once a week. It may come up, so it's something to consider. After school activities, this is a big one, and not necessarily because of the cost. It's not a huge cost, but it could be a huge cost depending on how many kids you have. But it's very important. And when you do have your Aliyah advisor, it's something to bring up when you have kids, and what kind of things they do with their times, and speak to other people, speak to your cousins and your friends and your families and people in the neighborhoods you're moving to, and find out what they do to fill their kids' days. There's afternoon activities, a very normal and common thing. And I'm not talking just about scouts and Bnei Akiva and Ezra and those kinds of things. They're very big here in Israel. There's a day that Tuesday and Shabbat are the days that those are mostly, they're mostly active on those days. But there's a lot of other things. It could be judo, it could be English, it could be rock climbing, it could be a million different things. It could be given by the school, it could be given by the community center. So there's a lot of things that are out there, and you should use them, and you probably will. But these are just so a lot of things on this list are things that are very accurate for families, and a lot of them will come up, and they will vary obviously based on the family itself. Childcare is the last thing I'm going to touch on, and then I'm going to give this back to Adina. But childcare, there's a big gap there in the numbers, and the reason for that is most kids from the age of 3, I shouldn't say most, a lot of kids from the age of 3 are in the school system. That is the youngest age you can go into the school system, and you can start putting your kid into, I don't know what that's called, pre-kindergarten, pre-something, pre-K. So that is for the ages of 3 and 4. And then 5, you start kindergarten. The tuition for those ages is low. It's similar. It's probably even a little bit lower than the regular school tuition. It's not a huge expense, but a lot of people choose to put their kid or 2 kids, depending on the age, whatever it is, in private kindergartens, private ganim, before the age of, up until the age of 5 sometimes. And those are more expensive. They can be anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 shekel a month per kid. Most times it's usually one kid that's in there, but twins are twins, and Adina's a twin. So there could be. I have friends who have 2 kids in private gun, and it's an expense, but it's their decision to make whether they want to keep the kid in a smaller group setting or part of the system at that age. But look at this, try and figure it out, try and compare it. There's a line here for what you spend nowadays. Try and see what you spend, and if it's something you think you can fit into your budget or not. And obviously, reach out to us with questions. We'll be happy to help.
Thank you, Yitz. And I think we're gonna end on that note that I always love the line, well, knowledge at your fingertips, but I would actually even say more that knowledge is power. And that means that the more research that you do and the more information that you gather, and that's where you guys are right now. Anybody that's watching this webinar is in that place right now. It will help you with the process. It will help you with once you come to Israel. And from my experience, as I said, I've been doing this for, thank God, a long time. The people that research and do the pre stuff and not just wait till the last minute, their Aliyah tends to be more successful. And please, you can see on the screen my contact information and Yitz's contact information. Please feel free to be in touch, and we look forward to welcoming you home. Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.